Says it's starting. And I assume we are on. So Mary Alice, if we are not on, you can come on and let us know. But hello, everyone. 6 o'clock, just shortly after 6 o'clock. So great to get started. My name is Eric Kussin, and I'm the founder of an organization called the hashtag Same Here Global Mental Health Movement. And I've got two very special guests with me, Joanne and David Hymowitz. I'm going to let the two of you guys introduce yourselves quickly, if you're comfortable with doing self-introductions.
Thanks a million, Eric. Yes, I'm Joanne Donka. I'm the Director of School Counseling Services in the Manhasset District on Long Island. And it's actually been a pleasure working with Same Here Schools as we have a huge drive for the most important aspect of students' lives, which is their mental wellness. So this is a great topic to be discussed, and I look forward to going forward with Eric and David.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is David Heimwitz. I am a social worker basically on Long Island. I've had about 30 years experience working with mental health and substance abuse, a lot of it in the schools and most of it in the communities. And I am a recent joiner to Same Here Schools. So very excited to share with you some of the stuff that we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years.
So thank you, David. Thank you, Joy. And I thought the best way to run this session for the next hour, though David will have to leave us at 6:45. So Joy and I will have to pick up the slack, is, inviting Joy, who is someone who oversees counseling department. Many schools, it's called different things, pupil support services, or, the professionals group, let's call it that, right? So have someone who's in the trenches at the schools, and then have someone like David who can help almost be, Joy, tell me if you like this term, be the consultant in a way that's helping schools to implement these social emotional programs. And we totally understand, for folks who are listening, not every school has the luxury to be able to have a consultant that works in district, right? So some of the stuff that we're going to share, David is our director of Same Here School programming in these schools where we have hands-on help directly, like in Manhasset at Joy's school. But I think a lot of what we'll share today will just be general tactics and strategies, so that whether you have someone there who can help you with this, whether it's stuff you're just picking up on your own and you can start implementing in your districts if you're in Joy's position, or you're a teacher in your school, or you're a parent who wants to talk to teachers in your school about these things, or talk to professionals in your school or administration, you'll be able to do so. And so during this session, what I'm going to go back and forth on here is I'm going to share some slides that I have to give some visuals to our discussion points, and then I'll come back to the video to discuss between David and Joy. So I'm going to ask as I share this, because sometimes the share feature, you never know, right? Technology, we never know if it's definitely working. So let me know, guys, if my share feature is on. And when I go to this first slide here, do we see that?
Yes.
Okay.
You are good.
So means we're in the right place, because we were at the looks like City Citizen Summit, right? And so I wanted to start with this slide, and then I'll come back off the camera, off this big screen, and David and Joy, we could have a discussion. But I think even for the schools that are in states or countries, because I know this is a global summit, where mental health is being mandated, it's still a very new mandate. July 11th, 2018, here in New York, is when they first started mandating mental health education in schools. So we're talking, this is really in its infancy stages. So I don't know as much in other countries, though we do work internationally with groups. Obviously, every country is different. And then here in the United States, every state is different. But the reason I wanted a table set that way is to say, in where we're at in 2020, especially with all the stuff that we're dealing with coming back from the pandemic, there's not necessarily a lot out there in terms of how do I create this comprehensive social emotional learning program for my school, for my district. And so in a slightly facetious way, but also or the reality of the situations is in most school communities right now, if we are even checking the box of trying to do something from a social emotional perspective, without it being a fully integrated program, it usually falls into only these two buckets alone. Bucket number one is, hey, we're going to have a presenter come in and we're going to do an assembly. And we'll talk about what some of the themes are, what some of those assemblies are, and what we're seeing out there in terms of the speakers. And then separate from that, usually not tied together, usually not integrated with one another, we're seeing a curriculum, right? We have a curriculum that lives on Beluga. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But whether it's a textbook, I see some schools, they have mini, almost children's books for K through 12, teaching mindfulness, teaching about the brain, right? And the development of the brain, even to kids as young as elementary school. But from a bucketing category perspective, most schools who are dipping their toe into this category, it starts with a speaker that they do an assembly program with, and then some kind of curriculum that they either have that's given in their health classes, or if we're lucky, it's given in more classes beyond health classes. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and I want to just discuss that topic really quickly with Joy and with David. And I hopefully, Joy and David, please correct me here. We did not pre-plan this, right? This is not something I asked. Okay. What are the potential pitfalls of, I just gave you the two buckets, a speaker, bucket one, curriculum, bucket two. First off, not being coordinated with one another. Two, a speaker specifically being what we use as an assembly alone, and what they specifically talk about, leading to discussing social emotional learning in our schools.
So I can go with that one first.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably one of my biggest frustrations when our state put out these mandates, because there's pros and cons to that. By not really giving you anything very specific to do, it allowed every school to kind of do their own thing. And there's definitely a pro to that if you're very creative, and if your school district buys into wellness to begin with. If a school district doesn't buy into it, then it's exactly what you're talking about. It's almost like going down a list and making a check. All right, we did this. We're doing wellness. We're doing SEL. The problem with those one and dones is that there's no consistency. They don't live. They don't continue to grow. And then what you wind up doing is every month trying to figure out, what are we going to do this month? Do we have something to do? Don't we? And so what we always talked about is that the only way that SEL is really going to be a wellness kind of a program and a concept is if it gets woven into the fabric of the school. It has to be a part of the life. And so we even discourage some of the schools from saying, all right, we're going to have a mental health night. And we're like, no mental health night, because then it becomes that one special night. Wellness should be part of what you do all the time. And so what we try to do with our program is weave that cultural change into everything, so that wellness isn't something special anymore. It's there like everything else. And so that's one of the biggest things. I think the second drawback is that when the curriculums come out, they're given to the teachers. I don't know a whole lot of teachers that get a whole lot of training in SEL or mental health. And so that puts them at a disadvantage, and you get the pushback right away. Another term that we learned this year, right? Pushback. What the heck is that? Pushback is when the teachers or anybody else says, that's not my job. That's somebody else's job. So when you make it part of the whole fabric, I think it changes everything. So that's what I think are the biggest drawbacks. And what we're trying to do in the schools is get them to really look at it as a district-wide part of what you do like everything else.
Love it.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed, David. I think one of the things that you have to really look at is your actual district. So you have to look at data. You have to look at the numbers. You have to look at surveys and so forth. But the other data you have to look at is what the makeup of the district is and what are the needs. So that can be brought to you by just talking to people, talking to kids, talking to adults. We tend to think that, especially when you go into the pockets of how you deal with mental wellness and how you deal with social emotional learning, we tend to think it's only for the kids. Who's on the front line with the kids? Faculty, staff, down to the custodians. They are on the front lines with them. So as David said, which is what he did for us in Manhasset, we train the teachers on the moment they hear something that a child is struggling socially or emotionally, that they can't, quote unquote, put a Band-Aid on, they come running down. So it's not just the mental wellness or the wellness team, meaning the counselors or the nurses, that have to deal with this, but it's also them. They need to be as comfortable as possible. And by training the faculty and staff, we got them more comfortable talking about it. I'm going to actually quote my mother on this. Big statement she likes to use is, that which cannot be talked about can never be laid to rest. And we have to start talking about it. And that means everyone. So David, 100%. When you start to check off a box, you lose that passion and you lose that drive, and you're not hitting the students where they need to be, because they're telling you, but you have to listen.
And in fairness, right? Some schools, there'll probably be some people listening on this right now and are saying, I can't get that. I want it for my school, but I can't get that buy-in from the higher level, right? And so hopefully what we're sharing here is, in some cases, the order with which we do things, going just to the students first, or the way that we do things, which I'm going to talk about in a second on the speaker portion of it, it'd almost be better for us to hold back a little bit,
right,
and present in a different way than to just start the way that we can kind of get in, and then we've lost the big reveal because now we're coming from a place where we got to dig out of, right? I'd say, as it pertains to that previous slide, with starting with the speaker and starting with the curriculum, the two most, when I one of the spaces that we're in is in schools. We do stuff with colleges and corporate offices and servicemen and women, but when I started getting in the school space, what I started to notice was it was very much a, what are the requirements, kind of what David was saying, and how do we check those boxes to make sure they happen? And so the opportunities that came to just me personally were, Eric, you have an interesting story. I won't bore people with it right now, but you have an interesting story from a mental health standpoint of what you went through. Can you come and share your story? The challenge, I would say, is with just building a program around beginning with just story share by itself, is everyone's story, if it's not positioned with some kind of umbrella message around it, the story usually ends up revolving around disorder. It revolves around this person's challenge with depression, this person's challenge with bipolar, this person's challenge with addiction, right? And some of these speakers get paid handsomely. So don't get me wrong, like Joy and David will probably laugh. Like, it'd be a nice gig to go around the country, just share my story, and you get paid handsomely because you're sharing a vulnerability. We lose the room, we lose the students, we lose the teachers if we begin social emotional learning with an assembly that's about an individual person's story, that's about a specific disorder. Because when it's about a disorder, you get people who turn away. That's one possibility, right? And then also, it doesn't frame it in the context of what social emotional health means to everyone and how everyone is a part of this, right? The curriculum then also, how is the curriculum, even if we have the most robust curriculum in the world, how is it tied to what we talked about with the speaker when we introduced this topic? So when there's a disconnect there, even when we're checking the boxes with both, what's happening is they're not speaking seamlessly to one another, kind of what David was sharing before. So I'm gonna go to some additional slides here. And David and Joy are probably laughing because at first I was like, I won't speak over slides. We don't need visuals. And then like a couple of minutes before, I was like, okay, it'd be nice to have slides. All right. So spoke about the disconnect and just checking the box. It would be really nice if schools looked like this, right? We use an American Sign Language sign. Same here. Same here means I face challenges. You face challenges. We all face challenges. So I asked the question at the top, wouldn't it be a wonderful world if our school communities all look like this, right? A whole same here community of people standing up, feeling when it comes to social emotional health, like we're all in it together. But that's not the reality of it. The reason it's not the reality of it is what is oftentimes communicated through these out of the box, again, speaker telling their story by themselves, and or what we see in the media on top of it, and or the curriculum itself, is the focus is on disorder. So I wanted to keep this slide up really quickly because I'm literally having nightmares thinking back to when we would have Mad and Dare assemblies back in the day when I was in school, and we learned about drugs, but we would learn about the statistics related to drugs, and we didn't learn about why people turn to drugs. The why was the thing that was missing. So we see these stats: 1 in 5 people have mental illness, and we want you to stop the stigma or stop the stigma. The challenge when we begin with these standard messages that we've seen out there for so long, and we build campaigns around this stuff, is we're creating two different groups in our schools. We're creating the 1 in 5 that have been diagnosed with a disorder. And then we're saying to the other 4 and 5 kids, you're healthy, fine, normal, okay, don't worry about it. There's nothing to see here. That's reflected also when we have to do from a crisis management perspective, and we're bringing kids into the guidance office. Those are the, quote, bad kids. We're creating the good kids and the bad kids. Then when we have campaigns that are stop the stigma, what are we doing? We're saying to the rest of the people who don't believe that this topic is for them, your group needs to stop stigmatizing this group, these kids who are going through challenges and have problems. So again, I know we're going to go more into the details of the actual programming itself. I'll go to that page in a second, David and Joy. But just if you don't mind piggybacking on those 2 points of when we focus on disorder alone, when we're talking about the concept of social emotional health, how does that narrow us? How does that pigeonhole us, number one? And then, beyond that, going back to the whole point of starting with students versus teachers, in it being pigeonholed, why does that then put us in a hole that we have to dig out of that we might not actually ever be able to dig out of if we start with the disorder messaging as the starting point?
Well, I mean, the way I look at it, what do you think of when you think of disorder? When you think of a mental disorder, I think of a hospital. You think of a straitjacket. You think of the most extreme situations, which have to be acknowledged 100% because they are real. But you can also have such feelings and maybe not be in the disorder range, as society puts it, but they have to be addressed. Again, we have to talk about it. So by giving the false hope that, hey, everything's fine, and you're not fine, you are just there. Talk about digging yourself into a hole. And we can't do that. It comes in all shapes and sizes. And I think that's probably the scary part of mental wellness, or mental health, I should say, is that it doesn't look the same on every single person. It's not like, oh, you broke your leg and now we're going to put a cast on it. It's not that easy. It looks different and it manifests different. And we have to acknowledge that wholeheartedly.
I think the other part that it does is, in addition to creating those 2 groups, it says to the 4 and 5 that you're okay. So now when these kids recognize that maybe I'm not so okay, but I don't want to be like those people. And so it makes it harder for them to reach out when they're having typical stress. And that's what I think the mental health covers, that it covers that everybody experiences some kind of stress and something that doesn't feel right. But if you say that the only ones you're really going to deal with are the 1 in 5, it says to everybody else, you can't really talk about it. And so sometimes I think we miss the other kids that are really struggling because they're struggling silently. And here's another.
But David, doesn't even so for both David and Joy, we're missing the other kids. But let's take the kid in class, which is, there's a lot of them, who is the good, smiling, happy kid. Okay, and I'm using those quotes purposely, right? Because one, that's a ridiculous way to categorize someone. But we're putting kids in that category. Yet, what we're dealing with in life, the challenges that we all face, which we'll get into in a little while, we're assuming those kids are perfect. Nothing wrong here, nothing to see. Let's focus on the 1 in 5, which makes the 4 and 5 not pay attention to what's going on with the 1 in 5. And then I could speak for what happens to you 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, just like plaque builds up in our arteries and our physical health. But yet in young kids in school age, we teach them jump rope for heart because we teach them how important heart health is. The good kids in class, the smiley kids, the ones who are in choir, playing sports, doing all these things, guess what? We're not teaching them anything. Or even if we are teaching them, if we get to a later place where we are teaching them the tools and the things that they can use, which we'll get into, they've already tuned it out because they think not them.
Yeah.
And when they think not them, you become the kid later on who didn't pay attention at the MAD and the DARE program because I don't do drugs. Why am I paying attention to this? This has nothing to do with me. I would have loved to have known, why do people turn to drugs? Why do people drink? Because they're in social and emotional pain because of this thing called life and these things that we go through, right? So hopefully what we're sharing as we're talking here, David and Joy, and for everyone who's listening, is there's so many good intentions of what to put out there, right? There's the Red Ribbon Week at school, right? Like talking about substance abuses. But when we do them out of order, when we do them as a check the box thing, it's not only that it's not fully integrated, fine, that's one problem, But potentially the bigger problem is we're painting mental health as this niche thing that applies to such a small group of people that we then, unfortunately, see this thing explode on us because the quote good kids, it might only be a month where they start to fall apart. It might not take 10 years, 20 years the way that it did in my case. So anything else to add on those before I go to additional slide?
Yeah, because then what happens is these kids, you expect because they're doing well that they have good judgment, that they have good problem solving skills. And yet when they're facing some of these things, not everybody has those skills naturally built in. And I love the fact that you talk about DARE, because that's one of my biggest pet peeves, is that we always say mental health as almost as if substance abuse is another creature. And so a lot of programs that we've seen around the country almost do it separately. Like we have Red Ribbon Week, but nobody is thinking about how does that tie into the wellness program? That's all part of it. And so for most of Red Ribbon Weeks that we've seen everywhere, they hardly ever deal with the elementary school kids because they're too young. But you know what? You can be doing things with them like, I'm my healthiest when I do this. I am healthy when I do this. I'm at my best when I'm like this. You have to start giving them that language so that by the time they get to the middle school, they already have some of that stuff. But leaving them out is just another thing that happens with we start to pigeonhole, even when we're doing SEL learning, we pigeonhole certain things and we forget, to me, it's all about wellness. And it includes all of those things and then some.
Mm-hmm. When you don't include everyone, that's when you create a stigma.
Yeah.
And which is ironic, Joy, right? As I'm going to this slide, and I think that's the what I realized going through what I went through and then forming this organization is we hear the term stop the stigma so often.
Right.
And the very organizations, schools, et cetera, that are trying to stop the stigma, we're actually feeding into it.
Correct.
Because unfortunately, by leading with disorder, we're putting people into those categories. I got to learn how to start on the correct slide here. So I wanted to start with this page, and this is obviously a lot to digest at once. So I'm gonna break this down in a simpler way than what's written here, and I'll just read the main bullet points, the titles of each one of the bullet points. But events, breakout sessions, which in the school language is often referred to as professional development. Okay, online courses, an app to be able to communicate teacher to student or student to professional, something that we call star rooms, which we'll get into in a second, which is exercise for the brain, creating a brand for schools around their social emotional delivery or platform that allows students to feel ownership in some kind of club that they're a part of. And then what David does with the schools on top of that, this ongoing engagement throughout the course of the year with someone from the outside who's able to help you kind of course correct and look at what you've been doing and saying, what can we continue to do? What can we learn from others? And what do we want to tweak? And so I'm going to start with the events piece. I'll go into it in a little more detail because, we talked about assemblies before. And what I shared, we want to be careful of is that events don't become an assembly where it's a check the box and it's one speaker. And that speaker talks about their lived experience. And their lived experience is about a disorder alone. And then we've had our event for the year. So purposely here, event is written in a plural way, events, right? And what you want to do is I would put pressure on whoever you are negotiating with or talking with or asking to come out and share their story to do these assembly programs, a lot of which have to be virtual right now, right? Unfortunately, because it's hard to get students together in one room. The reason why it's events plural is I truly believe in the more we're doing this, and this is something we're going to do even more with Manhasset right now with Joy's group, is using a person's story to set the table for how their life experiences, not their disorder, is what drove where they're at right now. So their life experiences, the divorces, the breakups, the job losses, the not getting into schools that they want, right? All the challenges that we face in life, then leading them towards a place of challenge, okay? What that does is in sharing that context of that story, and the recommendation for events, plural, is starting with your teachers and your school professionals, right? Because they're people too. They're humans too. They're the ones who are going to be delivering this message to your students. Is if the understanding from the teachers, the school professionals, the administrators are that mental health is this thing where we have to worry about depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, ADHD, etc., what's going to happen? That's all the teacher is going to look out for. And then the teacher is going to say, oh, well, is that kid diagnosed? Okay, let's send them to Joy's group if they are. And if not, they're not going to take into consideration themselves, their own lives, what they go through, the challenges they face, how those challenges impact their behavior, how those challenges impact the behavior of the kids that are in their classroom. So I'm going to build from events and breakout sessions, which I mentioned are similar to professional development, what we see it on the school side of things. And I'm going to go to David with this question to start off, coming from that, David. So you always talk about life experiences and the things that we go through, whether it's a thing that happened specifically today or something that happened in the context of someone's life, right? And one of the first times you and I ever met, David, you were talking about, maybe I'm calling you out here since we didn't discuss this before, but you were talking about a real life example where you were giving to teachers or school professionals how when they come into school one day, something that just happened to them in life may be something that they're bringing with them into the classroom when they're interacting with Jimmy or Sally, the same way that Jimmy or Sally might be bringing something with them in the classroom. And that's why when we're presenting these events at the beginning and these professional development that we're doing with the teachers at the beginning to roll out our program, describing social and emotional health in the context of life challenges as opposed to disorders is a better way to go. So do you want to dive into that, David?
Yeah. We often give people the image. We're very much about the optics. I think much more can be said with a picture than trying to explain it sometimes. And so we'll show kids with those backpacks. And I think it's probably consistent across the country and across the world is these kids come in with these backpacks that weigh 100 pounds. I don't know how any of them are walking upright for the rest of their lives after those things weigh them back. What we try to point out to them is that their lived experience, whether in school or outside of school, they carry a second backpack. And we call that the invisible backpack. And all of those experiences there, good experiences, not so good experiences. And so we try to get the teachers to understand, and anyone who we're talking to, even parents, is that if you can recognize that these kids are carrying around another backpack, that's how you can help them unpack it. And then we talk about the best way to unpack it is not only having one adult that they can trust or people that they can do, but then giving them tools. We talk about you need to build a toolbox. And the toolbox is to be filled with, do they know how to self-soothe when they're not feeling well? Do they know how to self-regulate? Can they make good decisions? Can they be facilitated? And so what's really great about that is a subtle message is it gives those teachers something to visualize. And we always talk about, like you said earlier, that bad kid. And so one of the things, if you know anything about trauma-informed care, one of the best sentences I ever heard is when we get upset with that kid that's having bad behavior or acting out or pushing our buttons, usually what we're thinking about as adults is, what the hell is the matter with that kid? Why are they doing this? And what we've learned is that because of what's in their backpack, it's not about what's wrong with them. It's always going to be about what's happening to that kid. And every time we tell those stories to adults, you can see their faces change because they're starting to connect it to themselves. Adults do the same thing. You always have someone in your school that you don't like, someone who's always pushing your button, someone that everybody's like, oh, here comes so and so. You don't want them in the meeting. And I always say to them, that's that same little kid that's now an adult. And it's not why are you being such a pain in the butt? It's what the heck's going on in your life. So adults come in with an invisible, whatever you want to call it, suitcase. But so that's what we love about that kind of stuff. And so giving them those understandings changes everything.
So David, actually go. So you teed up your example. I'm going to make you go into your example now because you'll remember when I give you the heads up on it here. You were talking about the teacher that gets cut off on the way to school as they're driving in. Do you remember this one?
Always. I always say to people that one of the best ways that we can help people is to teach them to reframe how they're seeing things, right? So where we are on Long Island, we all hate the highways. Everything is highways. It's always traffic, and you're always late for something, and someone always cuts you off. And if you've ever seen that experience on the road, people get really, really angry, right? They flash their horns, they blink their lights, they drive up really close, they cut the person off. I love the ones that scream in the winter when the windows are up and their veins are popping out and they're cursing their heads off, and you know the person can't hear you, but you got to do it because you're so angry. So what we always say to them is basic cognitive behavior stuff. The way you think about the situation. And if you personalize it, right, what happens is you personalize that person got up and they did something to you. And so now you're angry. And when you're angry, you're going to behave in very different ways. So we try to get people to say, and I use myself because I know I got like this. I'm like, Dave, do you really think this guy got up at 5 o'clock this morning and said, oh, good, I'm going to go find David on the road at 5:30. I'm going to cut him off and I'm going to ruin his day. Of course not. I just happen to be on the road the same time this other poor person who's angry is on the road. And once I can say that to myself, then guess what? I'm not angry anymore. And if I'm not angry, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pull over to a different lane. I'm going to go let him kill somebody else. But that's that reframing, that if we can get people to re-examine why they're seeing things and feeling things, it changes the rest of their day.
And what that teacher who didn't reframe yet brings into that classroom is, I'm angry because of that SOB who cut me off. But guess what? That kid who's coming into your class, it might not have been that they've been cut off because they can't drive yet, but something that did happen in their life that was their version of being cut off. Their parents are in a fight, or their friend yelled at them, or whatever it was. That's what they're bringing into the class with them. And so now, to your point, that the student doesn't hate Mrs. Smith, the student is just dealing with something that's making them act a certain way. Miss Smith is coming in and is upset because something happened where they got cut off on the road, and now it's trauma on top of trauma, and you have two agents, so to speak, that aren't able to interact with one another in a way that works together.
Absolutely. And we've done this exercise too, right? We do the what if exercise. You think about a typical kid, right? Gets up in the morning. Oh, I don't know. Did I study enough for the test? And by the time they get on the bus, they're all worked up. And what if I don't do good on the test? Am I going to pass the class? Wait, if I don't pass the class, am I going to get into the college? If I don't get to college, right? We all do that. So imagine how all these kids are coming in. They come in every morning with the what ifs in their head. And it's a perfect storm.
And so taking that, Joy, if you could dive a little bit deeper before I go back to the slides, so David talks about prepping the teachers after we do the events that explain that life experiences are what makes up the pie of mental health, and how the life experience contribute to us a scale that you have behind you, which we'll get into also,
Yes.
The back and forth of emotions and feelings that we can feel. Joy, why is it so important for, whether it's you directly or someone like David who's coming in, to not just stop once we've had that first event, but to continue to do what we call these professional development courses with these teachers, with these school professionals? David just laid the groundwork on that's what trauma is, and you're bringing that into the classroom. Why is it important to keep hammering home those messages with the adults in the room, so to speak?
Well, because if you think about it, the kids, it takes time for things to hit them. Okay. When I was listening to the DARE program, like 15 times when I was younger, the same exact program, I wasn't thinking about it the way that perhaps maybe I think about it now. It hits people in different ways. And you know what? It hits people and it delays. It's in a delayed way. So that student that is coming in and acting out, the parents may have been physically fighting the night before. And they might have been fine because they're so used to it. And then they wake up and something else happens. So you don't know what the triggers are, but you have to understand that the triggers come at a different time. And they come at times usually when you don't expect it. So you have to be ready for that. I love what you said about challenge. Some people tend to say that difficult things are more of a weakness. I don't see it that way. I see it as a challenge. And we know the challenges are not always easy to overcome. So we have to have that follow-up and that support. In order to be able to meet them where they're at and what they need in order to get over that next hump. The role is that, the teachers have to understand their own emotions before they could start to understand others. My staff, myself, have to understand our own emotions before we can really help others. And the follow-up and the constant trying to get through the challenges, so to speak, is so important.
And so the repetitive nature of it obviously is important. What we are also able to dive into is David could take things that are specific subjects within understanding the context of challenges and say, how do we better position these things? So I'll give one example just for the purposes of this session is, okay, we'll do a professional development session with the teachers and the professionals on the power of vulnerability. Right. How do you maintain your position of authority but still show some vulnerability so that it doesn't take away that position of authority, so that your students are more willing to open up to you? Such an important skill to be able to have, and something that folks are not comfortable with. Totally get it, right? The difference between what's personal and what's private. But being able to provide something that's personal, a little anecdote I'll share is we did a session where we were talking about how people feel about planes. and we were asking the students, do they think a plane is a scary thing or this smiley, happy thing to go on? And even though the kids raised their hands, one of the teachers raised her hands when we said the scary plane, and she was a second grade teacher who emailed me after the session, was like, I can't believe these questions I was getting from my students, because they think of me as this untouchable being that has no faults and nothing's ever wrong with me. And all I needed to do was say, I don't love going on planes. And now all of a sudden that opened up their whole world to all these questions. Okay, I understand we're not always the most comfortable with sharing that stuff, but think of the efficiencies that creates later on in your class, that you've got this trust level that you're now building with those students. As you reveal something to them, they feel a comfort level with you. There's less conflict in class. You're able to get through your courses, your education, everything that you're doing with them a lot more. Okay, so I'm going to go back to these slides here. People are probably hating me that I have to go to the beginning each time, but I'll figure it out eventually. All right, so the quilt, so to speak, of unfortunately when we present disorder first, is that this is what we have our students and even our teachers thinking about when they hear the term mental health. Another little anecdote I'll share is I do these sessions with school professionals like Joy. And in the 31 of them that I've done where it's just been school professionals, and I've asked them, when the term mental health is at the top of the board and nothing else, break up into little groups. In the left column in green, write every positive word association that comes to mind when you think of the term mental health. Right, in red on the right, in a column on the right, write every negative word association that comes to mind when you think of the term mental health. Doing that 31 times now, I've added them up. The top 22 words when referring to the term mental health in their mind were all negative. So, Joy, you were talking about it before. Hospital, hospitalization, crazy, out of their mind, lunatic, right? These are the things that come to mind. And this is mental health. Think about how that divergent that is from something like physical health, when we think of six-pack abs and we think of, some terms I won't say, but that you see on these magazines, but, eating almonds gets you to burn fat more quickly. Like, it's always in a positive context. When we hear the term mental health, we're thinking of a negative context.
Yep.
And so what we'll often do is when we're sharing with kids that this quilt that makes up mental health is not disorders, it's these things that often, based on the challenges in life that we face, we can start to feel these other things like hurting, foggy, numb, exhausted, getting by, stressed, struggling, unhappy. These are terms that we all use in everyday language, and I'll be the first one to admit I'm guilty of it. I never thought of these things in the context of mental health when I would feel them, right? I would just think of them, I'm exhausted. I just didn't sleep that well, right? You blame it on sleep, or I'm getting by, some stuff happened, but you just push it to the back and you don't deal with it. And so that was the rationale for creating the whole concept behind Same Here. And this is not a pitch. I'm just using this as a way to explain positioning, whatever the organization is that you work with or the idea that you're coming up with. For us, it was Same Here because what we wanted to show was that there is this opportunity for us to talk about whatever our brand main message is in the context of this idea. It's 5 and 5. It's all of us who face challenges. So 2 examples from 2 of the schools that we work with from a branding perspective. One, Joy's Manhasset, Manhasset, right? So they go by SET as their abbreviation. So the SET support, right? In the context of Same Here. And so you've got that visual to be able to all talk about it. Sayville Strides, and I don't have the acronym written out here, but the STRIDES each stand for a different letter that roll up into this concept of these attributes that we want to have as a school. But these are empowerment brands. We're supporting each other. We're making strides together. And what ties it together is that it's all of us. It's all of us who face the challenges, all of us who go through it. Because what we want to do when we're sharing these programs with students is we want to get them out of this concept. And I know I've shown this concept like 4 or 5 different ways so far in this session, is we want to get away from the them in that little circle, that group of people over there, and the us. We're mentally well right now. And it's something that Joy has behind her on her bulletin board back there. But this is something that we use. It's called the Same Here scale. And helping students to, and I'll come off the screen in a second, Joy and David, to discuss the scale and why it's important, or something like it is important, is because if you look at that scale, there's a linear nature to it, but it's not linear in that it's 1 through 5, where everyone's always going to pick the 3 because it's the middle, or it's 1 through 10 and someone's always going to pick the 5 because it's the middle. It's linear, so it helps us see people moving up and down. But most importantly is it communicates to everyone in the school that we all are able to fluctuate up and down on this. We all move up and down at different points in our lives, and it gets away from the concept of there are the good kids and the bad kids, the sad kids and the happy kids. No, these are different feeling words that we can feel any different hour, day, week, month, year, etc. And that's okay. It makes the kid who's the bad kid in the past not feel like they're stuck. It makes the good kid realize they need to work on staying that good kid, that healthy kid, that happy kid. I'm using terms that we don't use, but the way they think about themselves. And to also say, hey, there's susceptibility here. This is not something I could take for granted. This is something that I always fluctuate up and down on. And so I'm going to go back to the discussion with David and Joy right now. I'm looking at the time, David. I've got 4 minutes with you, so maybe I'll start with you here first. But David, why the need, whether it's our scale or some other way of doing it? I've seen zones, I've seen mood zones and stuff like that. Why the importance of communicating that mental health is on a continuum and that things can potentially change, as opposed to, the model of disorder and illness that we showed before?
Well, I think it goes back to what you had said earlier. I mean, the reality is that most people don't recognize that. They don't understand mental health and mental illness as two separate things, because even in the journals, they talk about it interchangeably in every article I've ever read. But I think what that does is it kind of, and I hate to use the word normalizes it, but it normalizes it. It basically says that we're all in this together. We all have similar experiences. We all have similar feelings, and that it doesn't have to be this highly stigmatized kind of thing. It really isn't. We all have this stuff. We're hardwired to have these responses to horrible situations and other things that go on in life. So for me, that's one of the most important things. And as you were talking, the thing that reflected in my mind is almost like saying, well, if you have mental illness, then you can never, ever function well. And the reality is that we almost put that in the corner, like, all right, you got mental illness, so forget you. We're going to write you off. And the reality is that's one of the biggest goals with mental health is for all of us. Those scales give us that opportunity, and it allows kids to recognize that they're going to get through this stuff. And there are things you can do. And it starts with recognizing your feelings and talking about it.
Awesome. David, before I let you go, or actually, David, should we let you go now since it's right at 6:45? That was perfect timing.
Absolutely.
Nicely done, David.
This is great. Good luck, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
See you later, David.
So, Joy, you have it behind your head.
Yes.
If you duck down in your office. We started to implement it as an app, which we're going to roll out more and more in schools, that allow students and teachers to check in on feelings. Can you talk a little bit about comfort level? I'm hitting you with a question again that you might not have been ready for.
Okay.
Comfort level from parents, from students, even from teachers in using emotions as the terms that we communicate through, instead of using descriptors and labels as the terms that we communicate through.
Comfort level. So the greatest thing about the scale behind me, and I do a lot of work with faculty and staff and kids, and it's always a conversation starter because it's something that's not like any other. During the pandemic, a lot of parents, not necessarily in this district, but other parents that I've known in other districts, have said, we are so sick of the 50 question surveys asking the same thing and requiring a paragraph. This we can point to. And one of the things I like to try to push them towards a little bit more, and the kids really get it actually quicker than the adults, which is interesting. Every single emotion up there, we felt. And what I also like to point out to them is, listen, what was your worst emotion? Obviously, they go to the red one, and just basically for the color. And I say, did that stay? And they say, no. So in the end, with the pictures, not only are they able to actually feel it, and not just think of it as a word and picture, they can picture it and they can look at it as the word, and then they can realize that, hey, listen, I'm okay. So in the end, this is temporary, and you're going to move back and forth on that scale. You're not going up and down. You're moving back and forth. So you're still okay, but it's gonna change. And then that's when you reach out to the trusted adult, and that's when you talk to us, and that's when you talk it out. Going back to that which cannot be talked about can never be laid to rest. You have to talk about it in order to go forward.
And thank you for pointing out, the design of the scale was designed by a number of school professionals and psychologists, side to side instead of up and down, 6 spots instead of 7. And again, this is not to ask people to use the scale. This is ask people to think about the tools that you're using. Why was 6 important to us instead of 7? Because the most common conversation we have as human beings is 2 walls talking to each other, 2 brick walls. Hey, Joy, how are you doing? Good, Eric. And you? Good. That means the answer is going to be the 3 out of 5, the 5 out of 10, or in this case, if we had a 7th spot in there, it would be the middle answer every time. We only gave 6 spots instead of 7 because we want to know, are they on the slightly upswing side of being okay or the slightly down swing side of being okay? That gives us direction. That's important for us to be able to take note of and see, okay, maybe this is something for us to keep an eye on. I'll also add from what you said in not being stuck there, even in the context of the children who've been diagnosed, right? Let's take the extreme. They have depression. They have ADHD. We know if they have ADHD, sometimes it's a difficult time concentrating. They get frustrated. Just because you have been diagnosed outside of the school by another school professional with disorder, what we're saying to these kids who have a disorder label bestowed upon them is you're not stuck feeling the worst category all the time. There's ways to fluctuate up and down. And I think that's so important because our human nature is to say things are, I won't use the bad term right now, but not going well. And then we vent about it and we keep in the same place venting about it. And we find someone else, and that's called the victim mentality, that we stay in that spot. By seeing that there's this fluctuation on this panel and being able to go up and down, even with the diagnosis, it doesn't mean that is our life. It doesn't mean that we're stuck there. It means we could fluctuate up and down on it. Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the slides now for the last 10 plus minutes that we have here. And I'll include you here as I'm talking through them. Joy is someone's gonna like email in, even though we can't, be like, Eric, you're destroying your presentation by going back to the beginning each time.
Listen, it's that visual.
Yes.
It's the visual.
So all right, so go back to the man and dare stuff, Joy, right? Like, so this drawing we had done, and I had this person drawn to look like Charlie Sheen, probably is the closest actor anyone can relate to here. But this is what I wish they would have showed us in the Mad and the Dare program, which is when we're not feeling ourselves, when we're not feeling good, when we're not feeling happy, these terms that we all throw out there, or if we use the scale, when we're struggling or sinking, right? What do we turn to? We turn to the things, not because I think anyone has a desire to be a bad person, but because, or to do something illegal, quote unquote, but because it's the quickest fix. When we're in pain, we want to get out of that pain. So you see the stuff that the Charlie Sheen figure is holding there, but it's stuff like caffeine and drinking as much coffee as possible so that we're awake and we're ready to go, and that fogginess isn't there. Depending on the age group of the students or the teachers, sex is one of them. That's what people will turn to get away from things. Alcohol, prescription drugs, gambling. Mine was work, right? I'll tell you right now, work is an addiction. So even those of us who love what we do, when it stops us from working on our stuff, the stuff we need to work on, the stuff we need to release out of us, and we enjoy going into work every day, you've all seen it in your places of work, even at your schools. The teachers that David was describing that might not be as open or talkative or whatever, it's because they're focused on so much of doing work because they don't want to deal with talking to you because they can't handle being in the moment and dealing with just stuff. They just want to busy themselves with work. Recreational drugs you see in there. And I even put sports, something to look out for with students. And even in ourselves, I again, being public enemy number one here is oftentimes we lose ourselves in the things that we're passionate about. So for the child who is the first one on the field and the last one off and is working out in the weight room all the time and is so into it, and we pat them on the back and we're like, you are the example for everyone. Question is, are they also working socially and emotionally on the stuff, that bag that David said that they're carrying? Because you could be the greatest athlete in the world. You could be the greatest chess player in the world. You could be the greatest singer and choir in the world. If you're not working on that bag keeps getting heavier and heavier. And so from a programming perspective with schools, we created this acronym called STAR. STAR stands for stress and trauma as the first two letters. So the two things that build up inside of us. The middle letter A is active, meaning we need to do active exercises, release and rewiring. So we can't have a social emotional program unless we explain to students what they're doing to release and rewire out from them the stuff that builds up inside them from life that impacts them and affects them. And I say this emphatically, and I'm probably raising my voice as I'm saying it, because sometimes when I talk with schools and they say, well, Eric, we do mindfulness practices, we do yoga stretches. And I say to them, do the kids understand why they're doing it? Oh, they're doing it because they're stressed. What are they stressed from, right? And so this narrative and the build and the explanation of how it fits into the big picture and the exercises being compared to what we do for physical health, like removing plaque from our arteries when we run and we do jump rope for heart. Well, what are we doing for our gym for the brain, essentially? And so, we have a whole list of practices. We give out cards that have the exercises on them. And they're, Joy, with your group, we took your school professor through a number of these things, but David calls it the toolbox also. Again, I call it the gym for the brain, but it's being able to position to kids and students in your class and the teachers and professionals for that matter, that there's something that they can do to take control of where they're at on that scale and to move them to a better place on that scale so that they don't feel like they're waiting just for life to get better because situationally things get better. No, they could take the bull by the horns. And on top of that, they can actually use these exercises to be even sharper and stronger and better in what they're doing, right? When we go to the gym, we don't only go to the gym when we're in the worst shape of our life. There's many of us who try to go to the gym when we're in the best shape to keep it going at an even higher level. Should be the same thing with gym for the brain. What if I want to catch more passes in my high school football game? What if I want to hit that high note in choir? What if I want to get great grades on a test? When we position these exercises as gym for the brain, we get away from thinking it's only the quote problem kids that are doing this. And we get more into this gym for the brain is for everyone at the school to be able to work on anything that we're doing. And so here's one example. We'll do an alternate nostril breathing with the students. And we create these cards. They're 8.5 by 11 cards that can sit in an office, can sit in a guidance counselor's room, can sit in a classroom, and you can literally sit down with these cards. It's got an explanation of how to do them on there. And so I'm going to come back here, Joy. I'm going to stop sharing as we wrap up here. And I'm going to take it back to kind of thinking about that slide that we started with at the beginning that has the different pillars, right? Events, professional development, the app that allows us to connect over the star, or not over the star, over the feelings and the chart that you have behind you. One thing that we didn't talk about is student-led clubs, right? We were talking with one school that is going to create a podcast around a club so that they can get each other talking and sharing stories about challenges that each of them are facing, creating these exercise rooms. When you hear that, someone who's in your position, who's already dealing with such a caseload of students who are coming in and there's fires you got to put out, and this counselor's dealing with this student, and this parent is causing this issue and stuff like that, right? Can you, as a school, do you have the luxury of not doing something like we just spoke about, even though there's so much on your plate? And I know that's a tough question to answer, right? Because it's like, so the question is, like, when you see all these things, that probably sounds like a lot for a school to implement at once.
Right.
What is the alternative? If you can't implement all these things, might the situations get worse? Might fires get larger?
Well, I think you have to look at it as, you can't look at it as the whole all or nothing. I think whatever you can implement. I mean, the fact of the matter is we started implementing this about 2 years ago. And Eric, you joined us really last year. And then we took you on even more this year. So we had already started implementing. And quite frankly, when we started implementing, the top blew off the pot because suddenly we gave everybody permission to start talking and we were running ragged. And that was really what pushed us to get to you and David as well is, I'm running ragged with the counselors and with the teachers, as that's my job. And that's my calling, I should say. I don't even see it as a job. I see that and I need somebody to help me, So how am I going to tell people to ask for help if I can't? So it kind of like morphs into something even bigger. So one of the things that I know I had to do is I have all these great ideas. I mean, now my head is spinning with what I'd love to do, but I have to stop myself and really take it down a couple of notches and realize that it's a slow process. It's a very slow process. So going back to that picture where you have the gentleman with the work belt and 9 million very unhealthy things, and you forgot food, because food is also a huge comfort seeker. That's the Band-Aid. That's the Band-Aid. And we can get along with that for a little bit. But the fact of the matter is, this takes work. And we have to get people comfortable with doing the work in order to be successful. So quite frankly, Eric, I'd rather just implement 1 or 2 things a year and make it over a number of years so that it doesn't seem as impossible. Rather than
I set you up with that question, right? Because I mentioned that we talk about this. No. It's perfect, because I wanted to put you in an uncomfortable place asking that question, because I think people see all those things,
right.
And I'm here sitting back being like consultant person, being like, you got to do this, right? And it probably becomes overwhelming for someone who's hearing it, because they're like, good luck getting my principal to agree to even an assembly. Like, that's really hard to do. They don't want to touch this topic at all, right? And I think what your school has done, even if you started a little bit out of order, if we would call that, based on this,
right.
that's no disrespect to the order. It's like, sometimes when you're getting into this, you take what you can do, or you think strategically. I'll be the first one to admit that we started with students first before we did stuff with teachers and professionals. Then we realized you got to start with the teachers and professionals before you go to the students. And so for folks who are listening, it's to take a step back and say, I have this caseload of these crisis situations, students that are coming in. It's probably worse now than it's ever been because of COVID. But is that a reason not to at least start to attack this, and not to get overwhelmed that I don't have all this? But what I would say is, think about the order, if you're going to start with something, of what you implement. Because if you go right in, David said it well, if you buy the social and emotional curriculum, and you're just like, hey, teachers, go have at it, and that's what you expect to change the culture in your school, to lower the rates, to get fewer kids having to come in, to get fewer crisis situations, to lose fewer kids, you might be creating a bigger problem than what you think you're trying to solve, right? Whereas if you start with laying the foundation about life challenges, and you do it with your teachers and your professionals first, you get them all on the same page, get them all. David's example, again, I made him go through because I love it, of, we're all bringing that bag with us. We're all carrying that person who cut us off. We're leading with that when we're having our interactions. When we get everyone in the school to think about situations each person is dealing with, I'll give one visual that I used to do with my sales staff when I was working in sports. Is, imagine everyone you're walking around in your school environment has bubbles around their head, and each bubble is something that's going on in their life. Now in sales, we wanted to know that person's a member of a band. We can get their band to come out to a game. That person's a member of a choir. We can get a choir to come out to a game. That's the bubbles that we want to fill in. But here with social emotional health, those bubbles represent the different things that are going on in someone's life that are challenges. Even if someone lost a parent 10 years ago, that bubble may still be a big bubble for them. And even, someone, again, in the moment is dealing with separation, either of themselves or their parents or whatever it is. That bubble's still going on. Things to take into consideration when we're interacting with that person. If we don't lay that foundation, and we just put a curriculum in front of teachers and students, guess what? The order, totally out of order, and we could lose people right from the beginning there.
And you have to keep your eye on the why. So, we didn't just come up with set support, or you didn't just come up with Save Those Strides without realizing that, what does that mean? Other than it's a very cool looking logo, what is it? What does it symbolize? And that doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't. But it could just be symbolized to the support. And what does that look like? So dig deeper. Totally dig deeper. And, and you don't have to implement everything. You got to go slow. And even just giving permission to talk about it is a huge implementation.
Awesome. Well, we funny enough, as I'm watching the clock turn to 7:02, and we started at 6:02, so this came out to exactly an hour. We got David off right at 6:45, which was perfect, depending on what time zone everyone else is in. But it's 6:45 here in the East Coast time, and so I know Beluga will keep this up. I know Digital Citizens will keep this up. I want to thank Mary Alice. I want to thank Evan from Beluga, the whole group of them all who work together. This is hopefully be something that I think is recorded. Other people can go back to, but this is something we can continue to do and continue to build on year after year and continue to grow this. So thank you, everyone. Oh, just some information if you want to get in touch with all of us.
Yep.
Our social handles on my end are at symbol same here, SAMEHERE_global. So that's Instagram and Twitter. Facebook is just / same here global, no underline, no underscore. And then the website is samehereglobal.org. So all of our contact information, if you DM us, if you want to do any of that stuff, you want to get in touch, happy to help. Doesn't need to be something that we formally work with you on. Could just be something that we're giving you our ear and we're helping you in any way we can. Joy, I don't know if you want to share anything.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is at DRJDANCA, at Dr. J Donka. So feel free to contact me. I'm in Manhasset Schools on Long Island, so you check the webpage and you can find my email address there, jdonka@manhassetschools.org, and anything I could do to help you. And as Eric said, just talk you through anything. I'm happy to do it.
Awesome. So thanks everyone again. Good hour together, and we'll hopefully do this again soon.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Good luck.